Is that on? Is that on now? Good. Okay. Maybe I pushed the button twice. I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to be using the book, The Domino Effect by Tim Lewis, to teach the class, just using it as a guideline. If you'll remember, and some of you may have that book at home, Tim Lewis was here several years ago. It was pre-COVID, so it's been long enough for us to forget and start all over again, I guess. So anyway, but he was here for a weekend. The domino effect, as most of y'all know, he uses that to describe the game. He used the dominoes as a kid, not to play dominoes, but to just line them up and knock one over and just follow a sequence and see what kind of designs or whatever you can make with it. It's a lot of fun. I've done that myself. If you go on YouTube, you'll see people that use dominoes and all kind of things to make things go in a sequence over a long area. Anyway, we're going to talk about that, and that book is about making decisions as a Christian and how we do that, why we do that, and looking at decisions from all kind of angles if we can. The first thing he mentions in the introduction is about making Bible-based decisions. And as I was thinking about that, he listed a number of things that will follow, like the domino effect, if we make Christian or Bible-based decisions. And the first thing that he mentioned was to glorify God. And I'm thinking, well, probably that is a wonderful question to ask if we've got any decisions that we need to make that's life-changing. We need to stop and ask ourselves first, before we make that decision, well, is there a way that this is going to glorify God or not? Because we're Christian and that's what we're supposed to be about. You know, most of the criticism that you'll see from people from the outside on Christians is that they're a bunch of hypocrites. They're a bunch of people. And what it is that as Christians, we know we sin and fall short of the glory. The book tells us we fall short of the glory of God. But we have to work every day with the decisions that we make so that when other people look at us, they will see that we are at least trying our best to live our lives according to God's purpose and not according to our own. So if the decision you're going to make is going to glorify God, then that's the way to go. That should be the deciding factor. The next point he made was, does it imitate Jesus? You know, I think about imitating Jesus. It's not about dressing the way Jesus dressed or wearing sandals when he walked down a dusty road, but it's talking about how Jesus treated other people. Jesus' attitude toward things. It's always amazed me, if you think about Jesus and the power that he actually had, and he could heal people and he could do things. He said at one point that he could call legions of angels, to defend him. He didn't have to go through the things that he went through on this earth. He didn't have to go through the pain and suffering that he did for himself, because he could have called those angels to stop the suffering, but he didn't. We need to imitate Jesus in the fact that we need to not necessarily take the easy course, but to realize that our purpose is to serve him. And in doing so, we need to emulate his life with ours as best we can. We need to make our decisions in our life based on how we treat other people and all, based on the way Jesus treated other people. It was taught that it was with love and with understanding. The person who's making Bible-based decisions will seek first the kingdom of God, as outlined in Matthew. In the verses preceding that, it talks about all the things that we think about. Clothes, food, the daily stuff that you got to make decisions on. But at the end it says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. We'll have the things that we need if we seek God first, if we seek to please him. The person who's making Bible-based decisions will saturate his life with prayer. And that's a given. If we're going to have a relationship with our Father, we need to talk to Him. Not that He doesn't know what we already need or what we already want, but that we need to talk to Him and it'll help us gain a better understanding of ourselves. But God wants that relationship. He wants to know that we want an intimate relationship with Him. You live by the golden rule, do unto others. And you will become, he uses the word incredibly influential. I know you'll become influential in your life. And most of us, at least I never think about the influence that I have on other people. But I know I have it. My job is to be sure that that influence is a good influence, not a bad influence. And I know at times that it's probably not been the best. But we must bear the responsibility that we do have an influence. We have an influence on the people that are closest to us, and even people a little bit further out that we may not even realize that we have an influence over. And the last thing that he mentioned was diligently purify his thoughts. And I've thought about that a lot. Being pure in heart. How do you become pure in heart? Once you've been out in the world and you learn words that are not appropriate and ideas that are not appropriate, how do you get that out of your system? You know, I was in the Navy for 4 years. And the expression, cussing like a sailor, was real. I was around people constantly that used bad language. It's hard for that not to influence you. It's hard for it not to influence me. If I'm around people that live a certain way, then that's going to have an influence on me. And I know by looking at that, the way that I live is going to have an influence on other people. So I need to be sure that no matter what I do, that I'm setting a good example before others. Of course, I've not always done that. And neither has anybody else, I don't think, always done what was totally best. In the process that he talks about, that we just talked about, glorifying God, imitating Jesus, all these things, that process works exactly in the reverse too. Just like I was just talking about that cussing like a sailor thing. If you're in a place where people are doing a lot of drinking, using bad language, laughing at dirty jokes, doing all the things that we as Christians are not supposed to be doing or be involved in, it can have an influence on you. We don't hang out in bars as a Christian. I heard a preacher one time was talking about that. He was saying, you could go and use the excuse that you're going to see how the sinner lives so you'll know what you're trying to fight. But that's not right. We need to know that we're on the right side of the decisions we make with our life. I know that y'all made decisions this morning when you got out of bed that you're going to get up and you're going to go to worship. You made another decision. Once worship was over, you were going to wait around a little bit, maybe fellowship a little, and then put yourself in this class, and maybe we can have a discussion that would help us all and be beneficial. I know that you're not supposed to look up things up on Google to necessarily believe what they say, but I did anyway. I succumbed to the temptation to Googling to try to find out how many decisions the average person makes in a day. And according to Google, and they had several references, we make 35,000 decisions every day. Now think about that. 35,000 decisions. I don't think 35,000 words in a day. I certainly don't think I make 35,000 decisions. But then if Looking on down, it said we make 773,618 decisions in a lifetime. I'm not great at math, but that didn't add up. So I divided it out. That's 22.1 years of decisions if you make 35,000 a year. So what do you do with the rest of your life? The point in saying all that is we know we make decisions, and we're going to make hundreds of decisions. We're going to make hundreds of thousands of decisions in our lifetime. Some of those decisions are going to be totally insignificant, and we won't even think about it. They'll just happen. But some of those decisions, we'll have to stop and think about which way we're going to do. You know, when a kid gets probably asked the question, what are you going to be when you grow up, 100 times at least, before he even can form a great opinion. And I can remember my second grade teacher asking me, she went around the room asking each individual, what you want to be when you grow up. I had no idea what I wanted to be when I grow up. I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do other than get to the third grade. But she come around to me and I said, well, I guess I want to follow in my daddy's footsteps. He was a mechanic. Well, I didn't give it much more thought than that. Later on, I can remember thinking, well, when I grow up, I want to be all these different things. I want to be a fireman. I want to be a policeman. I want to be a doctor or a lawyer or a veterinarian or something, you know, something significant. You know, the funny thing is it turns out I was a mechanic. If I wanted to be, really wanted to be, a doctor or a lawyer or a vet or a police officer, then the decisions that I started making when I was young and coming up would have led in that direction. But they didn't. And who is that on? I'm going to read you a story that he put in his book in the introduction about his dad and what his dad went through making decisions. He says, my father is what you might describe as a modern-day prodigal. His return to the Father's house gave birth to my faith. Dad dropped out of high school the summer after his junior year. He enlisted in the Air Force and was stationed in Roswell, New Mexico. While he was there, he met a member of the Main Street Church of Christ who taught him the gospel and baptized him for the remission of sins. Just at 6 months after his conversion, he moved back to home to Pennsylvania and gradually fell away from the church. After 20 years in the far country of sin, he took me, my mom, and my 2 brothers to Vacation Bible School at the 4th and Arch Street Church of Christ in Sunbury, Pennsylvania. We went to Bible class every night that week. We thought my dad had lost his mind because we were not church-going people. He said, my dad was a drinking man. He hosted beer drinking parties in our home. He said, I do not have any Bible school memories from my early childhood, but I do remember those parties. I remember how much fun it was to have all those interesting characters in our home. I also remember how lonely I felt when the party was over. We were left in our empty house with our empty lives and our guilty consciences. I had seen and heard a lot of things in my young life, but nobody had ever told me the story of God's redeeming love. My father knew that story, but he never made any effort to share it with me or any of the rest of the family until that 1 week of VBS. That was the beginning of a whole new life for us. Alcohol slowly disappeared from our home. Many of my father's rowdy friends must have figured out that they could no longer find what they were looking for at our house. One by one, they all disappeared. Even some of our relatives were no longer as comfortable around us as they once were. We started going to church on Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday night. Eventually, my dad was restored. My mother, my 2 brothers, and I were all baptized. In time, with great patience and careful instruction, My family grew in faith and practice. My dad served as an elder. My mother has taught Bible school classes for more than 30 years and is still active in her service. My brother Jeff serves as a deacon. My brother Mike and I are both gospel preachers. You think about that, and you think about that decision that their father made to go to 1 week of VBS to surprise his family. Started things off in the right direction again. Even though he had been sidelined from the time that he left New Mexico until that point in his life. He had been sidelined by decisions that he had made. He fell away from the church, but eventually, after 20 years, regained his footing. His influence affected his whole family, not just him. And that influence is going to go way beyond him. For 30 years of Sunday school, his mother was teaching classes to kids. Think of all the influence that she had. One brother was a deacon. He was responsible for stuff at church. He had influence. There had to be some changes in life to get to that point. And then 2 of them were gospel preachers. Just imagine all the hearts that could be touched. All the people's lives that could be touched by those that all started from one decision to take his family to VBS. Well, that's important. So what decisions that we make are going to make a big difference. Several things to think about is how decisions are going to affect your character. Decisions today determine the person that you're going to be tomorrow. Whoever you are right now is exactly who you have decided to be. Now that may be rough if you're not happy with who you are. But you are who you have decided to be. You're a culmination of all the decisions that you've made in your life up to this point. All the people you've let influence you, all of the ways that you want to follow. Some people would like to claim that genetics or environment helps to avoid personal accountability, but it does not. See, because I still think about back in school when I said I wanted to be a doctor or a lawyer or a vet or one higher calling. But I didn't make the decisions to stay on course with the courses I was taking or the grades that I was making to do better so that I could go to college, get the education required to do one of those jobs. I graduated high school. That was my goal. I didn't graduate high school with any spectacular grades. Matter of fact, I barely skid by or slid by. And that's not a proud moment in my life to think back that I should have done a whole lot better. I could have done a whole lot better. The decisions that I made when I was in high school were made by an immature kid who wasn't being responsible with the opportunities that he had placed before him. We could be doing the same thing today. We could be that person that makes our decisions not based on wisdom, understanding, and seeing what's going down the road. You know, we talk about building a house. There was a house down on Georgia 85. It was all framed up and closed in, but there was no windows ever put in it. For years, I rode past that house. Nobody ever finished that house. We don't start building a house until we have the funds to complete it, or the world's going to look at us like we're very foolish. The point in all that is the decisions that we make today are going to affect what happens down the road. Don't try to build something that you don't build a foundation under it first. The have the ideas and the areas where you can complete what you start. You know, two people can have the same parents. He tells a story of two young men who have an alcoholic father, raised in a home with an alcoholic father. Many of you may have seen families just like this. But the two boys grow up, and one of them emulates the father. Turns out just like him, an alcoholic. The other one wouldn't touch alcohol if he tried to force him, because he saw what it did to his home, to his parent, to his life, and he wanted no part of that. We can get sucked in by the people that we choose to be around, by our ideas of what's good. Robert Frost wrote, "Two roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that made all the difference." And that's true. The choices that we make today are going to be who we are tomorrow. We need to realize that. We need to take caution. We need to keep our lives on track. Well, not only that, decisions that we make today have consequences, inescapable consequences. You make the choice to, let's say, drink alcohol, and you drink to excess. Then you get cirrhosis of the liver, and your health is affected. Not only that, but you can lose your family because drugs or alcohol or whatever it is can just take over your life. You can succumb to the temptation to get away. Once we make a choice that takes us away from God, it can lead down a dark and dirty road. We don't want to follow those choices. Solomon in Proverbs, beginning in the first verse, and I think, there we go. He described fools. In chapter 1, beginning with verse 29 and 30, he says, "Because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord, they would have none of my counsel and despised my every rebuke. Foolish people, and I think we can say that at times in our lives maybe we fall under the category of being foolish when we don't make the right decision based on what we know to be right, and we can go against it. But those that refused Solomon's counsel, he described them as people that just despise his every rebuke. In verse 31, he says, "Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their own way and be filled to the full with their own fancies." When we make decisions, we're going to have to live with the outcome. Now, we don't often think about that, where that decision is going to lead us down the road. But every decision in life has an outcome. I decided years ago not to go to college because I didn't want to do the work. So I went to work, and I found out that I didn't really like the work I was doing, and I couldn't earn enough money that I thought I could earn. So then I joined the Navy, and I spent 4 years looking over the world. I got trained in a job, theoretically. There's a lot happened in that 4 years that changed the course of my life. I guess the one thing that changed the course of my life the most was I got married. That can make a wonderful difference. And I give my wife the credit for helping me and showing me the way. See, I was raised in the church. But I went through a period that was kind of dark, that I didn't go to church. I didn't behave like I was supposed to, and I hung out with people that I should never have hung out with. But I got over it, got back. I was in Scotland. There was only one small church in Glasgow called Castlemilk. Some of you may have heard of that church. My wife, I was in Scotland for a year. I came home and got married and took her back with me. We looked up that church. And we started going to that church, and you know, that little church in Castlemilk, we met people that still have an influence on our lives today. It's an amazing thing. We have friends that we still communicate with in Scotland because of that little time that we had in the Castlemilk Church of Christ. Solomon had no pity on those people that he described as fools and the people that would not accept his advice. Now, we know Solomon was the wisest man in the world. And even he didn't always make the right choices. But he says, because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, I also will laugh at your calamity, and I will mock when your terror comes. Some people believe in this life that no matter what we do or how we live, that in the end, God is going to forgive us and take us home. But that's contrary to what Scripture teaches us. If we go back to the first and start talking about the direction of our lives and the decisions we make and thinking about glorifying God with those decisions, to glorify God with our decisions, first we have to know what God's will is. We have to study His Word to understand what direction He'd have us going in and to go in that direction. God does not take away natural consequences for the sin in our lives. He can forgive us of the sin, but there's always consequences. Paul tells us in Galatians 6:7 that you reap what you sow. David, King David, was a perfect example of that. He committed his sin of adultery and murder. And the prophet Nathan come to him and explained to him his sin. David may have insulated himself from his own sin. I don't know about thinking he was king or he could get away with it or nothing happened at the time or hide his conscience from the fact. But when Nathan confronted him with his sin, David repented. David repented and God forgave him. But David had consequences that he had to suffer. Those consequences included the death of an infant son. His daughter was raped by his son Ammon. And Absalom conspired to kill Ammon. And then Absalom tried to take David's throne. He was killed in battle. That's in 2 Samuel 18. David was forgiven for his sin, but he paid an awful price. He paid an awful price for that sin. I think, kind of humorously, of the movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? If you saw that movie, maybe you'll remember the scene. There's a bunch of people walking through the woods wearing white robes, and they're singing a song going down to the river to pray. And they get to the water, and there's a guy out there baptizing people. One at a time, they're going out there and getting baptized, one right after the other. Well, these four guys that broke out of jail. And one of them he got the Spirit. He run out there to get baptized right quick. And another one told him, he said, God might forgive you, but the state won't. You still got to pay the consequence for the sin that you've committed. I thought about that a lot. It's a crazy little line, but it's true. We're going to pay. Sooner or later, we're going to pay for the sins that we commit. You know, you tell just a little bitty lie, and then down the road, you have to tell a little bit bigger lie to cover up for that little bitty lie, because you don't want to go back and admit that you lied in the first place. And it can grow and grow and grow until your whole life is a lie if you're not careful. You may have relatives like mine. Some of my relatives weren't too slick. Years ago, when my daddy was still living, I was talking about tracing our genealogy. And my daddy's words on that was, you may not want to do that, because you may find out something you don't want to know. Well, I found out a lot about my family history, and I've traced it back to all the way back to England. And I found in my history an illegitimate child of a king. And I found other things where people that have done things that weren't exactly honest. I had one relative that did time in a federal penitentiary. You know what when I think about those things, though, I think about those are results of decisions that people made in their own life. And they had to pay the consequences. You steal. Sooner or later, you're going to pay the consequences. You lie. Sooner or later, you're going to pay a consequence for doing that. You may not have to go to jail, but it may cost you your influence. And eventually, there's a possibility it could cost you your soul. We have to make the decisions regarding God, regarding our lives, regarding which way we're going, by first taking a look at our destination and be sure our route is correct. You know, Elaine and I were camping one time, and Sunday was coming up, so we was going to go to a local church, but we didn't know where it was. So we put it in our GPS. Our GPS is a wonderful thing. It'll get you where you want to go sometimes. On this particular Sunday morning, we left in time to get to church, no problem. We drove and drove and drove, and all of a sudden the GPS tells us, well, you've arrived at your destination. The only problem was we was out in the middle of the woods somewhere. There wasn't even a building anywhere, much less a church. So we missed church that Sunday because the GPS led us in the wrong direction. And I could say it's all the fault of the GPS, but it's not. It's my fault because I didn't investigate far enough in advance to find out where it really was. See, there can be one little glitch in an address, and you can give you a number and a street name, and then it can say like a SW or a NW or a whatever at the end of it. If you don't get that little part in there, you're going in the wrong direction. There's a lot of things that we need to realize and understand that falls on us. Making the proper decision to get going. And the decisions that can determine your destiny. Achan, if you'll remember, in the Battle of Jericho, he took some of the devoted things that he wasn't supposed to. And because of that, he made God angry. But his whole family was executed because of his sin, of his decision to take something he was not supposed to take. He had a little gold and a little silver, and he buried it in his tent. But God knew it. God was angry. Told Moses about it, so Moses does an investigation, finds out where it is, and asks Achan, why did you do that? Achan knew it was wrong. He knew that decision was not going to lead him to a good place. He knew it, but he did it anyway. We need to control our decisions, always with an eye on Jesus. That's all I'm saying. That's all this lesson means. Always make decisions in your life with your eyes on Jesus, and you'll be good to go. Well, that's our time for the class today, so we'll take up again next week. And thank you.